Beginners in orchestration typically learn about three basic orchestral textures. First, monophonic, where everybody plays the same thing, perhaps in octaves. 2, simple homophonic, like Bach chorales. And number 3, polyphonic, like a fugue. Then they may also learn about richer accompaniment textures, where the main line is still clear, but the accompaniment includes some kind of movement, not just block chords. But there are many other possible ways to think about textures. Even in classical orchestration, composers began to explore them. Actually, orchestral textures form a continuum, starting from monophony, where everybody plays the same thing, to totally random combinations, as in where an orchestra of 100 people is just asked to play whatever they want. However, although random experiments may occasionally throw up something interesting, for the most part they just sound random. And most people are not interested in spending time listening to random assortments of sounds. Let's look at some repertoire examples of composers thinking in novel ways about orchestral textures. Here's the beginning of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Beethoven starts with just a tremolo and sustain notes in the horns. Then gradually introduces short two-note motives accompanied by those tremolos in the background, turning around dominant harmony. This mysterious nervous beginning eventually culminates in the loud presentation of the first main theme in the tonic. The whole is held together by the stable dominant harmony and the timbre, tremolos and held notes. There's a clear motivic progression as the repetitions of the motives get closer and closer together. This is reinforced by the overall dynamic crescendo and the widening register. In other words, the texture isn't just static, it evolves with a clear direction in several dimensions at once. Our next example is the beginning of the third act of Wagner's Die Walküre, the so-called Ride of the Walküre. Since this is an opera, the music is used here to illustrate the story, specifically the Walküre, were female gods riding their horses. The movement starts with the accompaniment, which consists of multiple instruments playing scales and trills, turning around B minor. Then on page 2, the bassoons, horns, and lower strings introduce what will become the beginning of the main motive. On page 3, the strings add arpeggios, creating even more energy, so there's a progression in overall activity. The texture here does have a foreground line in the brass, but that only becomes clear with the arrival of the bass trumpet and horn after the introduction. Only then does the harmony start to evolve. As in the Beethoven, there's a registral progression here. At the start, the lower instruments aren't playing, they only come out on page 2. Now let's look at the start of Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe, suite number 2. This music is meant to describe the break of day. Ravel is perhaps the greatest orchestrator of all time, as we will see from the extreme refinement and subtlety of his texture. This is the richest texture we've seen yet. It starts off very softly, elaborate figuration of the two flutes combining notes from the main harmony, which appears in the strings with various non-harmonic tones. Harp glissandos subtly add even more movement. The string bass line starts on A and then moves down to F sharp. The F sharp supports a new harmony in the second bar. The texture remains similar here, but it's richer now. Clarinets do the same kind of figuration the flutes had in the first bar, but in the new harmony, which is sustained in muted horns. The harp acts as before the new harmony. The upper strings, which were in the medium-low register, now are much higher in harmonics. The F sharp in the bass then goes back up to A. The next two bars repeat the first two bars. Then they're followed by another change of harmony over a D sharp in the bass. The figuration goes back to the flutes again. However, instead of the harp, now we have celesta arpeggios. This then returns to the music we heard in the second bar. Then the D sharp harmony returns with the celesta figuration as before. Now the bass goes down to D, and the bassoons in the upper half of the double basses start to present a melodic line. As this line develops in the following bars, the main line in the low register is more thickly doubled, and the woodwind figuration becomes gradually richer. Also, a new element arrives made up of short harmonics in the strings and short piccolo notes. This represents bird calls. This texture is harmonically rich and it evolves in timbre. The Wagner and Ravel examples both are shaped like waves, and this is indeed very common in orchestral textures. It makes them evolve in a way that reminds us of nature, water in the sea, wind in the forest, and so on. I would like to talk about some more recent examples of orchestral textures, but copyright restrictions on YouTube don't allow me to include them. Here are a few more recent composers of textual music whose works are easily found on YouTube for the student to listen to. Ligeti, Takamitsu, Messiaen, Xenakis, and Part. Not all of their music is textural, but each of these composers has written significant works using this technique. One thing we can say about these more recent examples of textual music is they're usually dense enough so that no one single line is clearly in the foreground, at least not for any length of time. The interest lies more in the evolution of the whole. Let's do some experiments with textures. We can learn a lot from them. Here are our first two examples. The first example is made of chromatic clusters going back and forth with neighbor chords. Apart from that, it's harmonically and registry totally static, not very interesting. The second example is basically the same, but thicker. Again, without any noticeable evolution, it becomes quickly monotonous. Neither one of these is shaped like a wave. Now, two more examples. The first example here is the same idea as before, but with one important difference. The lower layers are added gradually, and in the last bar the bassoons go still lower. This example is more interesting because it evolves. There's a clearly perceptible pattern in the registral organization. The second one is the same, but with one more change. In the last two bars, the harmony becomes more diatonic. This harmonic change is much subtler than the change of register. The reason it doesn't stand out as much is because the clusters are so dense. Here's another example. What's different about this example is that the string pattern repeats every bar, but the horns repeat every two bars, so there are two planes of tone. Because of the orchestration, the horns are in the foreground. The strings here sound like an accompaniment. We notice them less, but the overall effect is still fairly static. As we've seen in all the examples so far, it's important to notice what stands out for the listener. As a rule, when the beginning is static, the listener will notice what changes. Another example. This time I've taken the same beginning, but I've modified the third and fourth bars. The horn parts are transposed up, and I've added a big crescendo culminating with the timpani attack. This makes the overall effect much more interesting since it now has audible direction instead of just static repetition. Let's take this idea further. Here are the same last two bars, but with another layer on top. The woodwinds intrude with syncopated accents. The texture has 3 layers overall. The dynamic peaks are simultaneous and are underlined with the xylophone in addition to the timpani. Is this better than the previous example? Well, the character is different. Depending on the context, it might be more or less suitable. Our last few examples all included more than one layer in the texture. The layers may or not evolve in the same direction or at the same rate, but as long as there's no kind of evolution, the listener gets more easily involved. Up till now, all examples have been called repetition. Here's a more random example. Although each instrument repeats the same rhythmic gesture, here there are no literal repeats. Is this more interesting? I don't find it so, since the overall effect is a kind of average, not really a counterpoint with independent lines. And these random lines are certainly a lot more work for the players. Now let's try the same thing but add another layer. Here our attention focuses on the brass, both because it's the brass timbre that's naturally in the foreground, and also because the brass line has a definite direction towards the peak in the 4th bar. As for the strings, they have more or less random pitches, but this is barely noticeable. They could have been more repetitive, but it would not have made much difference since they're in the background. Our next example is similar, but now with a crescendo, and the string parts have been adjusted to match the harmony of the brass. They also rise in register, as do the brass. Once again, the evolution makes it more interesting overall, and the coordination of the two planes, harmonically and registrally, makes it more coherent, so the character is clearer and stronger. This makes a substantial difference. One final example. Here there are several progressions going on at the same time. First, there's the overall crescendo, reaching a peak, accented by the xylophone and the timpani. Second, the texture thickens with the addition of the flutes and then the oboes. And the wind parts get gradually higher and the strings get lower. So this passage evolves in a more interesting way. Of course, I can't possibly cover all the possible textures with these few examples, but we can draw some general conclusions. When the texture just sounds totally random, the listener won't be interested for long. Texture needs some common elements, which stay relatively stable to be perceived as a coherent whole. When the texture is coherent but remains too stable for a long time, it's just boring. We need a combination of stability for coherence and variety to maintain interest. The dosage of each will depend on the specific situation and the character you're aiming at. Generally speaking, a texture of any length will need to evolve over time. This evolution normally takes the form of incremental progression, getting gradually higher or lower, louder or softer, faster or slower, more or less dense harmonically, register getting wider or thinner, timbrally more or less complex. In longer passages, these progressions may occur in waves, for example a series of crescendi and diminuendi that overall become gradually louder. In more complex textures with multiple planes of tone, not all the textures have to evolve at the same rate. Thus, in the same way that counterpoint can enliven a more basic texture, having the various planes move at different speeds and in different dimensions allows them to overlap, creating longer units and adding interest. I make these observations thinking about concert music. Of course, in film music or video game music, some textures may go on for longer times without changing, depending on the narrative. But in these cases, the music isn't the foreground. So, all orchestral textures have various dimensions that we can observe, which influence the overall effect significantly. To sum up, first, how many people are playing? How dense is the overall texture? Even if the individual lines are not audible, we can have a relatively thick overall texture or a thinner one. 2. How many layers are there in the texture? Having more than one layer creates a kind of counterpoint of layers that can be interesting to explore. 3. Is there any kind of registral planning? In principle, if the texture in question covers the entire audible range for a long time, it becomes fatiguing. Registral progressions are usually more interesting. 4. How about harmonic density? Is the texture harmonically limited, as in, say, the diatonic scale, or is it chromatically very dense? In general, the denser the harmony, the less changing one or two notes makes a difference. 5. Timbral density. How many kinds of timbre are present? All the various orchestral families are always present, as with the harmony, the less difference adding or subtracting one timbre makes. 6. Dynamics. What's the overall dynamic? Generally, loud and soft textures have more distinct character than mezzo forte texture. 7. Rhythm. Do we just hear attacks, or is there some kind of resonance? Is there a clear rhythmic motive? 8. Does it evolve over time? And in which dimensions? How fast does it evolve? How long does it stay constant? This is a very important aspect of textual music. If everything just stays the same for a long time, the results gets boring. On the other hand, if even one dimension, for example register, evolves in a noticeable way, the listener starts to perceive patterns, and they can be used to play with the listener's expectations. Finally, number 9, is there a climax? This is really an extension of the previous question, since a climax is really just the end result of a progression, be it in register, harmony, dynamics, etc. Note that not all these parameters are equally salient all the time. The composer always has to pay attention to what's clearly audible. Our examples and the above list of the musical dimensions involved should help guide student composers who are interested in textual orchestration.